Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. Universities today teach the same way that universities taught practically 1,000 years ago, before the advent of the printing press. Before the introduction of the printing press, let alone the internet, access to information was scarce. It was hard to get knowledge. And universities were initially set up to find a way to distribute knowledge. Very important and noble task. But around 500 years ago, that task became somewhat less important, as the printing press enabled the distribution of knowledge to a much broader and more acceptable audience. At the same time, people whose education developed alongside the printing press were able to consume that information better and better. Fast forward to the 20th century, global literacy rates skyrocketed. The majority of people in the world now have access to information. And more importantly, the internet has further lowered barriers to disseminating information. But when we see what universities are still doing, they are, for the large part, disseminating information. A professor stands on a stage like I am, in front of a crowd of individuals like you are, and recites facts, recites data, sometimes recites interpretations, but still transmits knowledge, professes knowledge, where professor comes from one individual to a crowd. Obviously, you can lecture to 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people using technology, but you still lecture. You can disseminate information that people are ready to receive using adaptive knowledge. Useful, but it's still a dissemination. Not a university to teach you a skill, not a university to teach you knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but an institution that would develop the mind to an extent that you would learn transferable, practical knowledge. The current universities aren't selecting professors based on broad applicable knowledge. They're selecting professors based on narrow expertise, often rigidly so. Right? People who explore a particular bioenergetic a concept, right? We'll have a theory as to the best way to optimize that bioenergetic channel. And there'll be other researchers halfway around the world that believe that that is the wrong way and that they know the right way. And they will spend 20 or 30 years battling one another trying to figure out which element or which perspective is correct. Now that's important for science. It's important for the advancement of knowledge. It's not particularly useful for education. Right? In education, you want somebody who is much more open-minded, who's broad, who can apply ideas in different contexts. But the current educational system doesn't promote that kind of thinking, certainly not the current tenure system. And so at Minerva, we don't have tenure. We pick professors that have extremely high fluid intelligence, that are very broad in their interests. And we find that those professors are far, far better educators than the ones that are very narrow, right? Despite being world-renowned, perhaps, in a particular field. We evaluate and assess professors on how well they teach. It's kind of a shocking idea in education. We forget that most people in academia get their jobs not based on how well they actually practice that part of their profession, but on how well or how quickly they publish. which again has almost nothing to do with the educational enterprise. Right? This is a problem. Right? We would not want to take our sick child to a doctor who isn't measured on how well he cures the child, but more so on how well he cooks. One is not particularly relevant to the other. You could say, well, you know, if you cook well, you have to know how to blend ingredients and think about proportion. You have to have steady hands. That's really useful for a surgeon. More useful is actually to measure how well they do surgery. But at the same time, we send our children for brain surgery, which is what education is. Rewires your brain. And have them operated on by people who are not trained in brain surgery, who don't have a program for brain surgery, who aren't evaluated on how well they perform brain surgery, and yet we're perfectly happy sending our children through that pathway. That's a problem. And so not only do we evaluate our professors on how well they teach, we also train them. We in fact spend a month untraining and retraining our professors in the methodologies of fully active learning, right, and measuring and teaching habits and concepts.
The one world challenge that I'm most passionate about is education. I believe that education not only benefits the individuals, but benefits everyone around them all the way up to the society as a whole. Education is the root of much of what is good about society and humanity.
Be it war, be it poverty, be it gender equality, increasing availability to education will solve a lot of these issues downstream.
I keep thinking of like the Indian mathematician Ramanujan. He came from nothing in India and was just lucky enough to find a book. And how many, Einsteins or Ramanujans are we losing in places where kids don't have access to education?
What excited me most was the prospect of being able to invent university education from scratch.
The bar is set very high here for what we're trying to achieve. I like having to try to meet that challenge every day.
Here, what we're trying to teach is how students can become involved in their communities, small and large, local and global, and try to figure out how to make the world a better place.
The world does not divide itself cleanly along disciplinary lines, at least real problems don't. Our curriculum is designed to dissolve disciplinary boundaries and teach students about how to relate approaches between fields and between those silos.
I teach the empirical analysis cornerstone. It's about how scientific thinking can be and should be used in our everyday lives, even if we're not scientists, even if that's not our chosen profession or career. It's important to have that logical and systematic framework when thinking about problems.
I would encourage young students today to follow their passion, to not set limits on themselves. They have the power to change the world. The craziest thing I ever did in college was to participate in the free speech movement at Berkeley. Defending free speech was really important to me because my parents had to flee Germany and Austria. We knew as a family what not having free speech and having democratic rights curtailed meant. So coming to the United States and seeing free speech throughout society, but seeing it curtailed the minute you stepped into campus property seemed like a great injustice.
What excites me the most about Minerva's curriculum is the ability for students to really craft their degree to meet their lifelong goals and desires. When I was in college, I wish someone had told me how much fun it would be to be a scientist. At the time, I was passionate about scuba diving and music. Now, I took my first biology class learned about cells, learned about genetics, and I never looked back.
My field of expertise is the cognitive neuroscience of music and pattern perception in the human brain. I think my earliest memory of music was lying on the floor of our living room when I was 3 years old, underneath the piano as my mom was playing, and watching her feet move the pedals up and down, and just being enveloped by the sound all around me. I think, like most teachers, I find my inspiration to teach from the students.
Our faculty are very smart and very accomplished at what they do, but their focus is not on themselves, not on the faculty, but on the students.
Another thing that isn't particularly useful when it comes to this form of education is not giving students the ability to apply what they've learned. One of the most useful ways of teaching useful knowledge, practical knowledge, is to actually allow students to apply it in real world situations. Another example, air traffic controllers. The individuals that help planes land on time are notoriously good critical thinkers. They have to manage how airplanes come, sometimes manually, especially before the age of computers, and account for changing conditions, changing weather patterns, human error in pilots, etc. And so a researcher decided to give air traffic controllers a general critical thinking test to see how they would score. Turns out they scored exactly the same as any other professional. No difference. Because what they learn to think critically, the decisions that they learn how to make on the job, are not translatable to other areas. And so we have one of the dilemmas, dilemma number one. How do you actually teach practical, useful knowledge, which is crucial for our form of government? And when I say our, I mean practically the entire world's form of government, for our society. How do you actually teach concepts that could be contextualized and recontextualized? Problem number one. Problem number two, the methodology of teaching. I mentioned that universities are teaching in the same way as they did for hundreds of years. Now think about what else we would find acceptable today to be practicing the way that it was practiced hundreds of years ago. Let's take medicine as an example. Let's assume that you all ate something bad for lunch and you got a bacterial infection. And you go to a doctor and the doctor says, I'll give you one of two choices. Choice number one, I have an antibiotic here, which has been tested and studied to kill this bacteria with a 90% efficacy rate. Choice number two is I'll take a leech and I'll put it on your arm and he'll suck out your blood. Anybody think the leech is a good idea? No, bad idea. Funny enough, the leech on your arm, though far less effective than the antibiotic, is actually 3 times more effective at curing your illness than going to a university lecture is at learning the material. That's pretty impressive, because the placebo effect, giving you a medication that doesn't actually do anything to cure you, but just triggers your body to start fighting the infection, is effective around 30% of the time. But sitting in a lecture and listening to a professor explain information allows you to retain only 10% of that information. In the medium term, not to talk about the long run. And so, sugar pills, placebos, pure placebos, are more effective at curing disease than our entire educational system is today at disseminating information. That's a shocker. And so not only do we have a problem in what we teach we have a big problem in how we teach. And this is where thinking about an intentional education matters so much. So now let's take a step back and think about what is it we're trying to do with a systemic, intentional, practical education. In day-to-day life, no matter what profession you're in, we encounter problems that we have to solve. In order to do that, we first and foremost have to analyze problems. Take the problem and break it down into its component parts. This is what's usually known as critical thinking. You then have to take those component parts and piece them back together. Find a creative solution, what's sometimes known as creative thinking or effective problem solving. Then once you devise that solution, you have to think about what are the unintended consequences of implementing that idea. Sometimes things that are designed to do something wind up doing a whole bunch of other things that actually counteract the intended solution that you designed in the first place. So you have to understand how systems work and interaction effects. And then, because we all live in the world, with society, with other people, you have to then figure out how do you implement and communicate well with other people in order to make these ideas, these solutions, into reality. How do you communicate well or interact well with other people? So these concepts are not particularly controversial. I think anybody would say, I want to hire an employee who is able to do these four things, namely think critically, think creatively, understand effective interactions, understand effective communications. Seems to make sense. But our educational system doesn't focus on these things today. And so when you design a system that is supposed to do these types of things, you have to keep a few things in mind. First, these big capacities, critical thinking, creative thinking, etc., are not homogeneous. They're not a thing. They're in fact composed of many things. Think about critical thinking. One form of critical thinking is evaluating claims. Somebody makes a claim, you can think about how do you evaluate that claim. But evaluating claims is also not a thing. Some claims you can evaluate using logic. Some claims you can evaluate using reasoning. Other claims you can evaluate using statistics. Others you can just think of counterclaims. Right? So each one of those are discrete components of claim evaluation. But then there are other forms of critical thinking. For example, making decision trade-offs. Do I take path A or path B? Well, to figure that out, you may have a completely different set of tools. For example, thinking of a cost-benefit analysis, which doesn't really come in handy for claim evaluation. And so critical thinking is a set of heterogeneous components, as is creative thinking, as is effective communication, as is effective interaction. And we've identified about 100 of these individual components that we refer to as habits of mind or foundational concepts. Habits of mind are easily triggered and then difficult to apply. For example, someone makes a claim, think of a counterclaim. Easy to trigger, hard to apply. Which counterclaim would make sense to apply? Hard to think about. Foundational concepts are the opposite. Relatively easy to apply, hard to know when to apply. Hard to know when is the right time to trigger. So for example, a statistical analysis, relatively easy to teach the methodologies behind one form of distribution versus another. Hard to teach the intuitions as to which statistical analysis would go well with what data set. But in both of these situations, context in teaching can be deadly. Because if you teach these ideas in a context, it'll stay there, at best. There's a story that my colleague likes to tell about one of his former colleagues at Harvard who taught an introductory physics course. And this course was taught to the non-physics majors. So these were people who would major in biology or chemistry but needed physics as an introduction. And the professor decided to make the course more relatable. And so throughout the class, he used baseball as an example for physics. Baseball has a lot of physics in it, trajectories, parabolas, etc. And so the students learned all about physics through baseball analogies, and it was time to give the final exam. And the professor had a problem because throughout the semester, he used every single baseball example he could think of. So when the final exam came, he wrote it using football analogies. The Harvard undergraduates screamed bloody murder. Unfair. You taught us a course about baseball, and now you're asking us about football. We can't do that. Football and baseball are what is referred to as near transfer. Very related to one another. Very different than, let's say, teaching a course on baseball and then talking about car collisions, right? Or maybe astronomy. But the mind just isn't wired that way. So how do you teach it? How do you teach generalizable practical knowledge? Well, the answer is very straightforward. You teach it using spaced deliberate practice in multiple contexts when you foreground the habit or concept as opposed to the subject. So rather than teaching a course about baseball that uses concepts in physics, you teach a course about the concepts of physics contextualized in baseball, and then the same context contextualized in astrophysics, and the same concept contextualized in biology. Now, you may notice that this is not the way universities are currently set up. Universities are currently set up finding people who have subject matter expertise, not that have general application expertise. Portion number 2 is the pedagogical model, how you teach. Explaining, professing to students about these concepts in different contexts won't be retained. We've already discussed how the lecture test-based methodology has a 90% failure rate, meaning 90% of the information that you're supposed to learn in a typical class is forgotten within a few months of the end of the course. We, of course, all know this. If we were to go back today and be given the exact same test, not even different questions, the exact same test that we took as undergraduates, that we got A's in when we were undergrads, we would get F's in today. We didn't learn the material. And so the insight into how to design pedagogy comes from the science of learning and the science of memory. And the science of memory has many different types of principles, but there are really 2 that are crucial, that are meta ideas, meta maxims that the other components feed into. The first one is thinking it through, and the second is making associations. Let me give you a seminal study, or give you an example of a seminal study that explains or demonstrated how important these things are. A group of researchers asked a set of individuals to come in and look at a list of phrases. It could be cup on table, chair on floor, light near wall, etc. Okay? And they asked the people to read those phrases and memorize as many as possible. They gave them a certain amount of time, then they gave them the test, and saw how many they could memorize. Then brought in a second group of people. And they told them to not only look at each of those phrases, but visualize them. Actually picture the mug that sits on the table, the chair on the floor, the light near the wall, etc. Same amount of time, and then they asked them to list how many phrases they could recall. Turns out the people who pictured the idea, pictured each of the phrases, could recall twice as many of those phrases as the ones that just were told to memorize the phrases by reading. So deep processing, right, helped actually memorize twice as many. But that wasn't the best part of the study. The best part of the study was that there was a third group. The third group were told to look at the same list and were told to visualize each one of the phrases, but they weren't told to memorize them. Just told to visualize, that's it. Under the auspices of doing brain scans and seeing how their brains were activated. And then, after they looked at that list, the time was gone, the researchers gave them a pop quiz. They say, okay, now recall as many of the phrases as you can. The shocking result was that the third group recalled exactly as many phrases as the second group did. The one that was told to visualize and memorize. In fact, the instruction to memorize didn't increase memory at all. That's a shocker. Because it turns out that when you deeply process and make associations, you get memory for free, whether you like it or not. And in fact, if you don't deeply process, it doesn't matter how many times people tell you, remember this, the brain won't recall. It's not wired that way. And so when you think about the implications of that for education, it means that students aren't deeply processing what it is that they're learning. They're simply not going to retain it. Hence, they will not learn it. The purpose of education. And so we approach education through a system that we refer to as fully active learning. And fully active learning means that 100% of students must be fully engaged at least 75% of the time. Professors at Minerva aren't allowed to speak for more than 4 minutes at a time, something I have violated many times over. Students aren't just called on to give responses to questions, but when one student is called on, every other student in the class is doing something else to engage with that activity. For example, they may be grading the response that the student that's called on is just giving. They have to always make sure that they are processing the information and creating original applications for it as part of the curriculum. So, this very straightforward concept of creating a scaffolded curriculum, a curriculum that introduces ideas and then reintroduces them at appropriate times in multiple contexts, and the fact that we fully engage the student seems straightforward, right? In fact, why wouldn't every university do it? And in fact, you could do elements of it without changing a thing. So for example, there are activities that you could produce fully active learning in a typical lecture room, right? You could issue puzzles or questions that you have students grapple with, working in teams, right? Thinking about breakouts, thinking about polling, there are all sorts of elements. You could even do semi-active learning techniques. For example, asking a question of students before picking the student that will answer it, forcing every student to actually process the answer, and then only once processing is done, then calling on a particular student to answer, etc. So there are various techniques in ensuring that. But when you get to a scale where you're trying to teach 100 or more habits or concepts, right, to a large group of students across many professors, many teachers that'll help them in that process, having light issues, right? That process requires data, requires the institution to track how well is a student mastering a particular idea, right? So if we were to try to teach students claim evaluation, and that was the only thing that we were to do, it's very easy to prepare every professor at an institution that says, well, you know, you have to make sure that students are learning how to evaluate claims, and you have to really make sure that maybe they use these 3 or 4 different techniques. And in your course, make sure that you ask about these things and make sure that students know how to apply them originally. That's straightforward. But when you go to a professor and say, here are the 100 things that I want to make sure that you test students on, that you make sure that they practice in your class in context, it becomes unwieldy. Even when you have a small class, even when you have 15, 16 students in a class, a professor can't possibly assess students on how they have mastered or not mastered any one of 100 different vectors. You actually have to get as many data points on the students from as many different professors and allocate which professor will test on which idea to which student. You simply cannot do that without technology. It's impossible. Similarly, fully active learning, making sure that all students are engaged, especially at scale, is close to impossible without technology. Right? Even things as simple as voting, right, is hard without clickers or some form of technology that polls students and gets their opinions. Professors can instantly see who in a particular class has been talking more than average versus less than average, so they'll know how to draw people into the conversation. All using a technology that enables these very intimate and advanced seminars to occur. There are implications as well for the institutional design.
Hearing my parents' stories of near-death experiences and surviving the genocide in Rwanda, to me that was reaffirming that there is a special reason why I'm here. I have seen the impact of education in rebuilding my country from ashes. Education innovation is something that I hold dear to my heart.
My parents really value hard work. They both had working class parents, and for them, education was their way up. I was looking at the traditional engineering schools because I love to build things. I wanted to invent, I wanted to create, I wanted to be excited, and I wanted to be passionate about where I was going. That's what drew me here.
Higher education in Kosovo is free. Even though Minerva's tuition is less expensive than other universities in the US, it is still an annual income for the average family in Kosovo. I worked very hard to first be accepted, but then it was even more difficult when it came to how am I gonna afford it, how am I actually gonna get here.
Getting accepted to Minerva, to me, it was just my dream coming true. I remember waking up to an email that had my financial aid package. That's when it hit me that I'm attending Minerva. To me, that was like the deciding moment because I wouldn't have been able to attend without the financial aid. It was just a very happy moment for me and my whole family.
Responsiveness. I'm a web development intern at Minerva's headquarters.
There you go. Yeah, let's check out that as a bad guy.
Not only does it help me pay for the college, but it's opened up this whole new way of having an influence on my own education.
Finding out that Minerva is going to support financing my tuition, my living costs, and offering me an internship opportunity really made the final decision for me.
There's something different here because suddenly no opportunity is closed off. You feel like every wall and barrier that you had before has been challenged and knocked down.
The diversity of students at Minerva has impacted me so much. They challenge me not only because of their different points of view, but also their compassion.
The panels would be about real issues.
If we're doing
I love that.
So if you're talking
When Minerva students leave this institution, I believe it in my heart that they're going to change the world for the better.
The question for this supper club is, if you...
Even up until now, it's been much about growing and the pain that comes with it. My passion is to improve the quality of education in Rwanda. Making sure that people have access to quality education will not only build a new generation that is educated and who are critical thinkers, but also a generation who will be shaping the future of the country.
It pains me that there are so many injustices in my country.
This makes me very happy that you guys are all here.
Half of the population in Kosovo lives under the national poverty line. I'm very passionate about alleviating that situation.
without the support of donors for financial aid, most of us wouldn't have even been able to come. This has opened up so many opportunities for all of us. There's something you get when making, and it's that you realize that you actually have a lot of power in your own hands. I'm playing an active role in my education, and I'm using my hands to build this university.
So if I have one message to you today in this conference, is not to think about how you apply particular technologies to make what currently happens at universities better, but how to stop thinking about anything that is currently happening and start thinking about what we want to have happen. What is it that society requires of our institutions of higher education? And when we figure that out, then think about how you can apply technology to enable that to occur. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take some questions.
I'd like to thank you for having lectured on education part rather than technology only. I think you're invited here because the school is known as, the university is known as technologically advanced. But I'd like to thank you that you have stressed the point of education philosophy than the technology only. And my question is, I'd like to be brief. Seeing the way that you teach the concepts, it looks to be that the number of concepts and the quantity of the knowledge should be reduced than what we have taught in traditional university. And I would like to ask you if you have any design or consideration about the number of concepts or the quantity of knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't mention this in the design, but if you look at Minerva courses, they're far, far fewer than a traditional university offers. And that's for two reasons. If you look at the traditional university course offering, they're largely separated into two types of classes, neither of which we teach. So class number one, which is the bulk of the time students spend at universities, is in the introductory level information dissemination courses. It does not make sense for students to pay tuition, for governments to pay subsidies to teach basic physics, economics, biology, chemistry, because it's all available online, all for free. And the idea that you would pay thousands of dollars to have a student sit in Economics 101 lecture is criminal. It just doesn't make any sense. You know, in the United States, as an example, the University of California system, 95,000 students a year take Psychology 101. Okay? If you look at the average tuition rates in California for the in-state, that means that on average, students are paying $2,000 for each one of those classes. That means that in California, only in the University of California system, $200 million a year is spent on Psych 101. Right? Think about what that means across all of the United States. Think about what that means around the entire world. Tens of billions of dollars spent on teaching one course which can be read in a book, seen online for free. Right? And so that's the first part of education which we think has to be reformed, because economically it doesn't make sense to reproduce the same exact content over and over and over again for every institution. The second group of courses are what we often refer to as faculty hobbies. Right? So you'll see, go to one university and you'll see that they will have for a course on the Renaissance gardens of Italy, and then you'll have another course that'll offer in a different university the gardens of Victorian Britain. Well, why is in one university they think that the Victorian British gardens are more important to study than Renaissance Italian gardens? Well, it's because the professor happens to do the research on that area. Well, this is a little bit absurd, right? Because these are more esoteric and more related to what the professor is interested in teaching, less about what the student needs to learn. And so at Minerva, we have two different kinds of courses. One kind of course that we teach is what we refer to as seminal ideas. And these are habits or concepts either across all fields, in a particular cluster of fields, or at the intersection of fields. Without mastering these ideas, you simply cannot call yourself a domain expert. It is impossible. And so they are boiled down and distilled to the core ideas that you must master. So those are the courses that we have constructed centrally and then offer. We then flip, and for the very upper level courses within your particular area of study, we have the students actually decide what it is that they want to study. And then we pair them with the appropriate professor, 3 students at a time, 3 students to 1 professor, and then enable them to construct the syllabus together and explore that. And so they do that through tutorials, which is what I described. They have a capstone project, which is student-directed, or practica, which is where they go and actually work in an institution in the real world and apply what they learned day to day. So we think that that's a better combination of what universities should be focused on, and that the other stuff, maybe a university will certify or verify that you've learned that knowledge, but frankly, the best way to certify that is by actually taking the seminal courses, because you have to learn the basic knowledge in order to apply it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
인공지능과 우리 인간의 어떤 대결 구도라 그럴까? 혹은 가장 어떤 자기 생존 본능이라고 하는 가장 기본적인 능력하고 붙어 있어요. 매트릭스 영화에서도 던지고 있지만 모든 거는 뇌 안에서는 융합적인 전기 신호일 뿐이죠. 지능은 한마디로 예측하는 능력입니다. 지능이 탁월해지면, 다른 말로 하면 예측 능력이 탁월하면 원숭이의 하부 조직이 될 수밖에 없어요. 우리 인간 뇌는 태어날 때 완성되어 나오지 않는다는 거예요. 그 연결 속에서 뭔가가 생기는 거예요. 우리를 가장 잘 알려면 우리의 뇌를 가장 알아야 돼요.